Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be completely alone in the world? Not just lonely, but utterly and completely alone, beaten down, covered in mud, with nobody in sight to help? Imagine being at the very bottom, where the only thing keeping you going is the faintest whisper of hope that maybe, just maybe, something or someone might save you. This is exactly what happened to a woman named Sarah, a woman whose incredible story of survival reminds us that even when everything seems lost, life always has one more card to play. Sarah had always been the kind of person who believed in second chances, not because she was naive or foolish, but because she had learned that life had a way of turning darkness into light when you least expected it. At 32 years old, she had faced more challenges than most people twice her age, but nothing could have prepared her for what was coming. The summer morning when everything changed started like any other day. Sarah woke up in a small apartment, made herself a cup of coffee, and looked out at the world with cautious optimism. She worked at a local community center, helping troubled teenagers find their way in life. It was meaningful work. Work that made her feel like she was making a real difference in people's lives. But this job had also made her too trusting, too willing to see the good in everyone around her. That afternoon, a man came to the community center asking for help. He introduced himself as Marcus, and he told a heartbreaking story about how he had fallen on hard times and needed assistance. Sarah listened to him carefully, and something in his story resonated with her. She decided to help him, offering to drive him to a shelter across town. It seemed like a simple act of kindness, something that thousands of people do every day without thinking twice. But Marcus was not who he pretended to be. As Sarah drove her old blue sedan down the rural highway leading out of the city, Marcus became increasingly aggressive. He started with angry words, accusations that she had insulted him or didn't believe his story. Sarah tried to reason with him, tried to calm him down, but his behavior escalated quickly. When she reached for her phone to call for help, Marcus grabbed her wrist with such force that she cried out in pain. The next few minutes were a blur of violence and terror. Marcus beat her repeatedly, his fists landing on her face, her body, anywhere he could reach. Sarah fought back as hard as she could, using every ounce of strength in her body. But Marcus was larger, stronger, and filled with a rage that seemed almost inhuman. She felt her consciousness slipping away as the hits kept coming. Her vision became blurry. Her body went numb with pain, and she wondered if this was the end. When Marcus finally stopped, Sarah could barely move. Blood ran down her face and into her eyes. Her ribs screamed with pain with every shallow breath she took. Marcus dragged her out of the car and threw her onto the muddy ground beside the highway. She was somewhere in the rural outskirts of the county, in a desolate area where there were no houses, no people, no witnesses. The only sounds were the chirping of birds and the occasional sound of a car passing on the distant highway. Marcus left her there without saying another word. As his footsteps faded away, Sarah lay on the cold, wet mud, unable to move, unable to call for help. Her phone was gone, taken by Marcus before he left. Her car was gone too, driven away by someone who had proven himself to be a monster wearing a human face. The pain in Sarah's body was intense and overwhelming, but the pain in her heart was even worse. She had tried to help someone, had shown compassion to a person in need, and this was how the universe had repaid her kindness. She felt abandoned not just by Marcus, but by the world itself, by God, by fate, by whatever force governed human existence. As night fell, Sarah remained lying in the mud. She was too injured to move, too exhausted to even cry anymore. The temperature dropped, and the darkness grew so complete that she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. She wondered if anyone would ever find her, or if she would simply lie here until her body could no longer sustain itself. The thoughts that went through her mind during those long, dark hours were the kind of thoughts that people rarely speak about, because they are too painful, too raw, too honest. She thought about her mother, who had died when Sarah was just 18 years old. She thought about the friends she had lost touch with over the years, people who had drifted away when she was too busy or too broke to maintain those connections. She thought about the life she had planned to live, the dreams she had carried with her for so many years, and how all of it seemed to have slipped away like water through her fingers. Sarah had always believed that there was a reason for everything, that even bad things happened for a reason, and that she would eventually understand why. But lying there in the mud with her body broken and bleeding, she couldn't find any reason that made sense. She couldn't see any purpose to the pain she was experiencing, any meaning to the suffering she was enduring. The night seemed to stretch on forever. Hours passed like minutes and minutes felt like hours. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she thought she heard voices, and her heart would leap with hope, only to realize that she was imagining things. Sometimes she felt warm, even though the night was cold, and she knew that was not a good sign. She had heard somewhere that people who were dying sometimes felt warm and peaceful right before the end, and she wondered if that was what was happening to her. But Sarah did not die that night. Instead, she lived through the night, moment by moment, breath by breath, holding on to life by the thinnest of threads. When morning came, the sun rose over the horizon and cast its light on the place where Sarah lay. She was still alive, though barely. Her body was covered in mud and blood. Her face was swollen and bruised beyond recognition. Her ribs, she was almost certain, were broken. She couldn't move her left arm, and her right leg felt like it was on fire with pain whenever she tried to flex it. But she was alive. Somehow, despite everything, she was still alive. Sarah lay on that muddy ground for another full day. Cars passed on the distant highway, but none of them stopped. She tried to call out for help, but her voice was too weak, too damaged. She had bitten her tongue during the beating, and every word she tried to speak caused her pain. She managed to move a few feet away from where she had been lying, crawling on her stomach like an animal, trying to get closer to the road, but the distance was still too great. Thirst became her biggest enemy. Her mouth felt like sandpaper, and her lips were cracked and bleeding. She tried to crawl toward a small stream that ran a few hundred feet from where she lay, but she only made it a few feet before the pain forced her to stop. She lay there, panting and groaning, wondering if she would die from her injuries or from dehydration. It was on the second night that Sarah hit what she can only describe as the absolute bottom. She had not eaten in almost 48 hours. She was so thirsty that she thought she might actually go mad with the need for water. Her entire body was screaming with pain. She was covered in mud and blood and dirt. She had no hope, no expectation of rescue, no belief that tomorrow would be any different from today. And that was when she made a decision that changed everything. Sarah decided that she didn't care anymore if she lived or died. She stopped fighting against the pain. She stopped hoping for rescue. She stopped praying for a miracle. She simply gave up. She lay there in the mud, looked up at the stars above her, and accepted her fate. This was how her life was going to end. Then so be it. She had done the best she could, and now it was time to let go. In that moment of complete surrender, something unexpected happened. Sarah's mind became strangely clear. Instead of the panic and despair that had been overwhelming her, she felt a strange kind of peace. Her racing thoughts slowed down, her breathing became steadier. It was as if her body was preparing itself for the end, and her mind was okay with that. She thought about all the people she had helped over the years in her work at the community center. She thought about the kids whose lives she had touched, the teenagers who had turned their lives around because someone cared about them. She thought about the random acts of kindness she had done, the times she had bought a homeless person a meal, the times she had stopped to help a stranger, the times she had listened to someone's problems when she was too tired to listen. And Sarah realized something that changed her perspective entirely. Even if she died right there, right then, in that lonely place, her life would not have been meaningless. She had made a difference in the world. She had changed lives. She had shown people that it was possible to care about others, to believe in them when they didn't believe in themselves. So while Sarah waited for death to come, she wasn't afraid anymore. She was sad, of course. She was in pain. But the terror that had gripped her for the past 2 days was gone. She had made peace with the possibility of dying, and in making that peace, she had somehow found the strength to keep living. But Sarah still did not know that someone was looking for her. She did not know that people had noticed she had disappeared. She did not know that a search was underway, that volunteers were combing through the rural areas near the highway, that her disappearance had become a missing person case that was getting more and more serious attention. And she definitely did not know about Comanche, the beautiful and intelligent dog who was about to become her unlikely savior. Comanche belonged to a man named Robert, who lived about 2 miles from where Sarah lay in the mud. Robert was an older man, retired now, who spent much of his time walking his beloved dog through the countryside. Comanche was a mixed breed, part German Shepherd and part something else, with a reddish-brown coat and intelligent amber eyes that seemed to see right into your soul. On the morning of Sarah's third day in the mud, Robert was taking Comanche for their usual walk along the back roads near his property. They had done this thousands of times, and it was their routine, their ritual, their time together away from the world. Comanche was an exceptionally intelligent dog, the kind of dog that seemed to understand things that ordinary dogs didn't understand. Robert had trained him over the years, but Comanche seemed to have instincts that went beyond anything Robert had taught him. As they walked along a lesser-used road that ran behind the highway, Comanche suddenly became alert. His ears perked up, and he stopped walking. Robert felt the change in his dog's demeanor immediately. Comanche was not a dog who reacted to things without reason. When he focused on something, it was always for a good reason. Robert tried to coax Comanche back to walking, but the dog refused. Instead, Comanche turned and started walking toward the area where Sarah lay, pulling on his leash with a determination that was unusual for him. Robert was confused, but he trusted his dog. He followed Comanche as the dog led him through the underbrush and toward the muddy area where Sarah was lying. When Robert and Comanche came upon Sarah, Robert's first reaction was one of shock and horror. He had been expecting to find some injured wildlife, perhaps a deer or a fox, something that Comanche's sensitive nose had picked up on. But instead he found a human being, a woman covered in mud and blood, barely alive. Robert immediately called for an ambulance on his cell phone. While they waited for the emergency responders to arrive, he used water from his thermos to gently clean Sarah's face so she could breathe more easily. He spoke to her in soft, gentle tones, telling her that help was on the way, that she was going to be okay. When Sarah heard Robert's voice, when she realized that this was not a dream or a hallucination, when she understood that rescue had actually come, she broke down crying. She had given up. She had accepted that she was going to die. And then, against all odds, against all probability, someone had found her. A stranger had found her, and this stranger was trying to help her. But it wasn't just a stranger. It was Robert and his dog Comanche. And the dog had sensed that Sarah was there, had known that she needed help, had led his owner to exactly the place where a human being was dying. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics were shocked by Sarah's condition. They had to carefully place her on a stretcher, being cautious with her broken ribs and her other injuries. As they loaded her into the ambulance, Sarah looked back at Comanche, who was standing beside Robert, watching her with those intelligent amber eyes. Even through the pain and the exhaustion and the lingering shock of her ordeal, Sarah felt something shift inside her. She had been given a second chance. A dog had saved her life. A stranger had found her when she should have died. And somehow from this darkness, a light had emerged. This was not the end of Sarah's story. This was only the beginning. The hospital room was white and sterile, filled with the constant beeping of machines that monitored every aspect of Sarah's vital functions. She lay in the bed with tubes running from her arms, her face bandaged, her ribs wrapped tightly. The pain medication flowing through her veins kept the worst of the physical pain at bay, but nothing could numb the psychological wounds that Marcus had inflicted on her. The doctors had told her that she was fortunate. The word stuck in Sarah's mind like a piece of glass. Fortunate. 3 broken ribs, a fractured left arm, a severely sprained ankle, deep lacerations on her face and body, internal bleeding that had required emergency surgery, a concussion that had left her with gaps in her memory about exactly what happened during the attack, and they called her fortunate. Sarah supposed they meant fortunate that she was alive, but sometimes lying there in that hospital bed, she wondered if being alive was really so much better than not being alive. The police had come to interview her on her second day in the hospital. Detective Williams was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor. She asked Sarah to recount what had happened, to describe Marcus, to provide any details that might help them find him. Sarah tried her best to help, but her memories of the attack itself were fragmented and traumatic. She remembered his voice filled with anger. She remembered the feeling of his hands on her. She remembered the mud and the darkness and the pain. But the details that Detective Williams needed, distinguishing marks, specific words Marcus had said, any identifying information, were harder to recall. Still, the police found Marcus 3 days later. He had abandoned Sarah's car at an airport parking lot, thinking he could escape. But he had made mistakes. He had used Sarah's credit cards to buy a plane ticket. He had tried to sell some of Sarah's belongings to a pawn shop. He had left physical evidence in Sarah's car that connected him to the attack. By the time the police caught him, Marcus was trying to board a flight to another state. The satisfaction that Sarah expected to feel when she heard that Marcus had been caught didn't come. She thought she would feel relief, vindication, justice. Instead, she felt something more complicated. She felt relief that he was caught, yes, but she also felt a strange emptiness. His capture didn't undo what had happened. It didn't erase the attack from her memory. It didn't return her to who she had been before that terrible afternoon. Robert came to visit her on the third day. He brought flowers and a card signed by several people in his neighborhood who had heard about what had happened. But more importantly, he came with news about Comanche. "A dog hasn't stopped thinking about you," Robert said, pulling up a chair beside her hospital bed. "He keeps going to the door and looking out toward the road like he's expecting you to come back. I've never seen him act quite like this before." Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. Does he know I'm okay?" "Dogs know more than we give them credit for," Robert said with a gentle smile. "But I'll tell you what, when you get out of here, when you're ready, I think he'd like to see you, and I think you might like to see him too." Over the next several days, Sarah's physical condition began to improve gradually. The pain became more manageable as her body began to heal. The doctors said she would need physical therapy, would need time to regain her strength, would need several months to fully recover. But the acute danger had passed. She was going to live. However, as her body began to heal, Sarah found that her mind was struggling. She developed nightmares that would jolt her awake in the middle of the night, her heart racing and her body drenched in sweat. She had panic attacks when she heard loud noises or when she encountered unexpected movements. She found herself unable to trust people, unable to believe that someone she encountered wouldn't hurt her. A psychiatrist named Dr. Patterson came to see her regularly. Dr. Patterson was a woman in her 60s with grey hair and a soft voice that made it easier to talk about painful things. She explained to Sarah that what she was experiencing was completely normal, that trauma affected the brain in ways that were beyond conscious control, that Sarah's body was trying to protect her from future harm by remaining in a state of heightened alert. "The fear you're feeling is your mind's way of trying to keep you safe," Dr. Patterson explained during one of their sessions. "But the problem is that your mind can't distinguish between a real threat and a perceived threat. So you have to teach your mind, slowly and gently, that the world is not entirely dangerous, that there are people you can trust." But how could Sarah teach her mind to trust when trust had nearly killed her? After 2 weeks in the hospital, Sarah was discharged. She couldn't go back to her apartment. Marcus had violated her home, and the thought of being there alone made her feel ill. Instead, she went to stay with her cousin Margaret, who lived about 30 minutes away from the hospital. Margaret had taken time off from her job to care for Sarah, to help her with the physical tasks that her injuries made impossible. Margaret was a nurse by training, and she approached Sarah's recovery with a practical, no-nonsense attitude that was sometimes frustrating but ultimately helpful. She made sure Sarah took her medications on time. She helped her with her physical therapy exercises, which were painfully difficult. She encouraged her to eat, even when Sarah had no appetite. She made her get out of bed and walk around the house, even though Sarah desperately wanted to just lie there and avoid the world. It was during one of these walks around Margaret's house, about a week after her discharge from the hospital, that Sarah broke down completely. She was slowly making her way from the bedroom to the kitchen when the reality of her situation suddenly crashed down on her. She was 32 years old, and her life had been turned upside down by a moment of kindness. She had lost her apartment. Margaret was helping her financially for now, but Sarah knew she would have to face finding a new place soon. She had lost her job temporarily, though her employer had been understanding about her need for medical leave. She had lost her sense of safety, her ability to trust, her belief that the world was a place where good things happened to good people. Sarah made it to a chair in Margaret's living room before her legs gave out completely. She sat down and began to cry, deep, wrenching sobs that came from the very core of her being. Margaret was there in an instant, holding her, letting her cry, not trying to fix it or minimize it or offer meaningless platitudes. "I just want my life back," Sarah said through her tears. "I want to be who I was. I want to trust people again. I want to not be afraid all the time." "I know," Margaret said, holding her close. "I know. And you will get there."
It's just going to take time.
Days passed. Sarah continued her physical therapy, gradually regaining strength in her injured arm and leg. The bruises on her face began to fade from purple to yellow to a sickly green before finally disappearing. Her ribs healed, and the sharp stabbing pain when she breathed became less intense. Physically, she was getting better. But mentally and emotionally, Sarah was struggling more than ever. She had tried to return to her apartment once, hoping that being in her own space would help her feel like herself again. Instead, she had a full-blown panic attack the moment she opened the door. Her hands began to shake, her breathing became rapid and shallow, and she felt absolutely certain that Marcus was somewhere in the apartment, waiting for her. She had to leave within 15 minutes, and she hadn't been back since. Margaret suggested that Sarah might benefit from group therapy, from being around other people who had experienced trauma. Sarah was resistant at first. She didn't want to sit around talking about her feelings with strangers. She didn't want to hear other people's horrible stories. But Margaret was persistent, and eventually Sarah agreed to attend one session just to see what it was like. The group met in the basement of a community centre, in a circle of folding chairs. There were about 12 people there, ranging in age from a woman who looked like she might be in her 70s to a young man who couldn't have been more than 25. Some of them looked like they had experienced physical trauma, like Sarah. Others bore no visible marks but carried invisible wounds that were just as real and just as devastating. That first session was difficult. Sarah listened to other people's stories, a woman who had survived domestic violence, a man who had been robbed at gunpoint, a teenager who had been assaulted by someone she knew and trusted. She heard stories that were similar to her own, and she heard stories that were far worse. And as she listened, something began to shift inside her. She was not alone. It was such a simple realization, but it was profound. There were other people who had experienced what she had experienced, other people who understood the specific kind of fear and trauma that came from being hurt by another human being. Other people who woke up screaming in the middle of the night, who couldn't trust strangers, who flinched when someone moved too quickly near them. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she found herself telling her story. She told them about Marcus, about the attack, about lying in the mud for 2 days. And she told them about Comanche, about the dog who had saved her life. As she spoke, Sarah noticed that something was changing inside her. The trauma was still there. It would always be there, she thought. But by speaking about it, by hearing herself tell the story out loud, she was slowly taking back some of the power that Marcus had stolen from her. She was no longer a victim who something had happened to. She was a survivor who had experienced something terrible and had come through it alive. After the group session ended, 2 other women came up to her. One was named Jennifer, and she had survived a similar attack several years earlier. The other was named Lisa, and she had been hurt by someone she thought she could trust. "It gets better," Jennifer said, and Sarah could see in her eyes that she meant it. "It doesn't go away completely, but it gets better. And one day you'll realize that you haven't thought about what happened for a whole hour, then a whole day, then a week. And then you'll look back and realize that the trauma doesn't control your life anymore. You do." But it seemed impossible that she would ever not be afraid, ever not be hypervigilant, ever be able to trust again. During the next week, Robert called Margaret and asked if Sarah felt ready for a visit. He had something special to share with her, he said, something that he thought might help her healing. When Robert arrived at Margaret's house, he didn't come alone. He had brought Comanche with him. The moment Sarah saw the dog, something inside her opened up. Comanche walked directly toward her, his amber eyes fixed on her face. And he didn't jump or bark or act boisterous. Instead, he very gently rested his head on her lap, as if he understood that she was fragile, that she needed tenderness. Sarah reached down with her good arm and touched the dog's soft fur. Tears began to form in her eyes again, but these were different tears. Tears of gratitude, tears of connection, tears that seemed to release some of the pain she had been carrying. "He wanted to see you," Robert said softly. "I think he knew you were here, and he wanted to make sure you were okay." For the next hour, Sarah sat with Comanche, stroking his fur, feeling the warmth of his body against her leg. She didn't try to talk to Robert or Margaret. She just sat with the dog, and the dog sat with her. And something that had been broken inside Sarah began to slowly, painfully start to mend. That night, Sarah slept without nightmares for the first time since the attack. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She called her employer and told them that she was ready to start thinking about returning to work. She called a real estate agent and began the process of looking for a new apartment. She made an appointment with a local bank to discuss her financial situation and how she might move forward. She was still terrified, still struggling with the aftermath of trauma. but she was also beginning to understand that she had survived for a reason. She had survived because Comanche had found her. She had survived because Robert had listened to his dog. She had survived because people cared about her. And she had survived because deep down, even when she had given up, some part of her had still wanted to live. Robert began visiting once a week, always bringing Comanche with him. The dog became a lifeline for Sarah, a living reminder that there was still goodness in the world, that there were still beings who could be trusted. Comanche never judged her. He never blamed her for what happened. He simply sat with her, offered her his companionship, and seemed to understand her pain in a way that only another creature who had suffered could. As the weeks passed, Sarah's physical healing accelerated. She completed her physical therapy and regained full use of her arm and leg. The psychological healing was slower, more complicated, and would take longer, but she was no longer lying in the mud, covered in blood, waiting to die. She was alive. She was healing. She was beginning to find her way back to herself. 4 months after the attack, Sarah returned to work. It wasn't the grand, triumphant return she had sometimes imagined in her recovery dreams. Instead, it was quiet, understated, and deeply meaningful. She walked through the doors of the community center where she had worked for the past 6 years, and her colleagues welcomed her back with warm smiles and genuine concern. Some of them had been terrified that she wouldn't return at all, that the trauma would be too much for her to overcome. But Sarah had something that many people didn't have. She had Comanche. The community center's director had agreed to allow Sarah to bring Comanche to work with her, recognizing that the dog provided emotional support that was as real and important as any medication or therapy. The teenagers who came to the center were immediately drawn to the beautiful dog with the amber eyes. They asked about him, wanted to pet him, wanted to know his story, and through Comanche, Sarah found a way to connect with them again. There was a 15-year-old boy named Devon who had been in trouble with the law. He had been angry and hostile and resistant to any kind of help when Sarah first met him at the community center, before her attack. When she returned after her recovery, Devon was waiting for her. "I heard what happened," Devon said one afternoon, his voice carrying a mix of anger and concern that came from his own experiences with violence and trauma. "I heard some guy beat you up and left you in the mud." She had learned through therapy that it was okay to talk about what happened, but it was still difficult. "But you came back," Devon said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, said with a respect that Sarah hadn't expected from a troubled teenager. "I came back," Sarah confirmed. "My mom got beat up by my stepdad," Devon said, and it was clear that this admission cost him something. She didn't come back. She just gave up. She's still with him, even though he treats her like trash. "I always wondered what it would take for her to just leave and try to be happy again. But watching you come back here, seeing you with that dog, seeing that you didn't just give up, maybe that will help her. Maybe she'll see that you survived and maybe she can survive too." Sarah realized in that moment that her survival wasn't just about her own healing. Her survival, her visible recovery, her determination to keep living and keep helping others. It was a message to everyone around her that trauma didn't have to be the end of the story. It was just a chapter. A painful chapter, but not the final chapter. As the months continued to pass, Sarah found herself becoming a counselor to other people who had experienced violence and trauma. She didn't have formal training in this role. She was still a counselor at the community center, working with at-risk teenagers. But people gravitated toward her because they could see that she had survived something terrible and had come out the other side. She was living proof that it was possible to be hurt and still keep going. The group therapy sessions became a significant part of Sarah's life. She moved from being someone who simply attended to be a participant in the group. She began to help facilitate the discussions, drawing on her own experiences to help others find their way forward. And Comanche came with her, and the dog seemed to understand that he had an important role to play in the healing process. Other trauma survivors would reach down and touch Comanche, and they would feel the same calming, grounding effect that Sarah felt. 6 months after her recovery began, Sarah appeared on a local news program to talk about her experience. The reporter asked her if she had any regrets, if she wished she had never tried to help Marcus, if she wished she had been more careful, more suspicious, less trusting. Sarah thought about the question carefully. "I think the worst thing that could happen, the thing that would hurt me most, would be to become someone different than who I was before," she said. "Marcus tried to hurt me physically. But if I let him change who I am, if I become a person who can't trust anyone, who can't help anyone, who's afraid of everyone, then he wins. He wins completely. But if I get through this and I'm still a person who believes in helping others, who still sees the good in people, who still wants to make the world better, then I win. I survive not just in body, but in spirit. The reporter followed up with another question. Do you think you would help someone like Marcus again? Sarah paused. That's a harder question, she admitted. I think I would help someone, but I would be smarter about it. I would take precautions. I would be careful. But no, I wouldn't let what happened completely change my willingness to help people in need. Because if I did, then what kind of world would we live in? What kind of world would it be if everyone who got hurt decided they would never help anyone again? After the news program aired, Sarah received hundreds of messages from people. Some were from people who had experienced trauma themselves, people who said that seeing Sarah's courage had given them courage. Some were from people who wanted to support her, who wanted to help her in whatever way they could. And some were from people who wanted to help Comanche, who had become something of a celebrity after appearing on the news. Robert came to visit Sarah with news. A local animal shelter had been hearing about Comanche's remarkable story and had approached Robert with a proposal. They wanted to train more dogs like Comanche to help trauma survivors, to work with people who were recovering from violence and abuse. They wanted Comanche to be a volunteer ambassador for the program, to help train other dogs to do the kind of work that he had naturally fallen into. He's already saving lives, Robert told Sarah. But imagine what he could do if we trained an entire program of dogs like him. Imagine if every trauma survivor had access to a companion animal like Comanche. Sarah realized that her survival had opened up a possibility that she had never imagined. Her terrible experience, the attack that had nearly killed her, the days she spent lying in the mud waiting to die, all of it could be transformed into something that would help other people. Her pain could be meaningful. Her suffering could have purpose. Over the next year, Sarah worked closely with Robert and the animal shelter to develop what they called the Healing Companions Program. The program trained dogs to work with trauma survivors, teaching the animals to recognize signs of panic and anxiety and to respond with calm, grounding behavior. Comanche became the program's flagship participant, demonstrating to other dogs what was possible, showing trainers and handlers what a truly compassionate and intuitive animal could do. Sarah also continued her work at the community center, but now her role expanded. She began running workshops and support groups specifically for people who had experienced violent trauma. She spoke at schools and community organizations about the nature of trauma and recovery. She became a voice for people who had been hurt, a living example of how it was possible to survive and even thrive after experiencing violence. A year and a half after the attack, Sarah decided to move into a new apartment. This might not seem like a big deal to most people, but for Sarah, it was a significant psychological milestone. She had finally reached a point where she could live alone again without being consumed by panic and fear. She had finally reached a point where her new apartment wasn't just a place to hide from the world, but a place where she could build a new life. Robert helped her move, and of course Comanche came along. As Sarah sat in her new apartment that first evening, looking out at the city lights from her balcony, she thought about how far she had come. She thought about the woman who had been beaten and left for dead in the mud, barely conscious and convinced that she was going to die. That woman had seemed so far away now, like a different person entirely, but Sarah knew that she would never forget what that felt like. She would never take for granted her physical abilities or her safety. She would never stop believing that human compassion mattered, that helping others was important, that connection and community were essential to healing and recovery. Margaret came to visit Sarah in her new apartment and brought a housewarming gift, a beautiful framed photograph of Sarah with Comanche. In the photo, Sarah was smiling, genuinely smiling, with her hand on the dog's head and her eyes bright with a kind of joy that only comes from surviving something terrible and coming out the other side intact. "Look at you," Margaret said, looking at the photo and then at Sarah. "Look at who you've become." Sarah looked at herself in the mirror in her new apartment. The scars on her face had faded significantly, and while they didn't disappear completely, they no longer seemed to define her. What defined her now was her strength, her resilience, her unwillingness to be broken by what happened to her. 2 years after the attack, Sarah received an invitation to speak at a national conference on trauma recovery and resilience. Psychologists and therapists and support workers from across the country would be attending. The invitation made her nervous. She was not an academic, not a scientist, not someone with years of formal training. But the conference organizers wanted her there precisely because of that. They wanted someone who could speak from real experience, someone who had lived through trauma and survived it. On the day of her speech, Sarah stood in front of 2,000 people in an auditorium, with Comanche lying at her feet on the stage. She looked out at all those faces. Some of them were people who had experienced trauma themselves. Some of them were therapists and counselors trying to help others heal. Some of them were simply people interested in understanding the human capacity for resilience. 2 years ago, I was lying in the mud, convinced I was going to die, Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. I had been beaten by someone I tried to help. I was broken, bloodied, and alone. I had given up. I had accepted that this was the end of my story. But my story wasn't over. A dog named Comanche found me. A stranger named Robert rescued me. And slowly, painfully, I began to heal. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that recovery is simple, or that if you just believe hard enough, everything will be okay. Recovery is messy and complicated and difficult. There are days when I still struggle. There are days when I have nightmares. There are times when I still feel the fear and the pain of what happened to me. But I'm going to tell you that recovery is possible. I'm going to tell you that healing doesn't mean forgetting what happened or moving on like it never occurred. Healing means integrating that experience into who you are, while still being able to find joy, connection, and meaning in life. It means letting the trauma be part of your story without letting it be the entire story. And I'm going to tell you about Comanche, who showed me something that I had forgotten, that there is still goodness in the world. There are still beings, human and animal, who will help you, who will stand with you, who will not judge you for being hurt. If you're struggling, if you've been hurt, if you're trying to figure out how to keep living after something terrible happened to you, know that you are not alone. There are people and animals who care, who want to help, who understand what you're going through. As Sarah spoke, there wasn't a dry eye in the auditorium. People stood up at the end of her speech and applauded, not just because she was inspirational, but because she was real. She was honest about her struggles. She didn't pretend that everything was perfect now. She didn't offer false hope. She simply shared her truth, and in sharing her truth, she gave others permission to face their own truths. After the speech, dozens of people came up to Sarah to talk to her. Some of them shared their own stories of trauma and recovery. Some of them talked about how Comanche's story had inspired them. Some of them asked for advice on how to help a loved one who was struggling with trauma. And Sarah listened to all of them with the same kind of compassion and presence that she had always given to the teenagers at the community center. 3 years after the attack, Sarah was asked to participate in the sentencing hearing for Marcus. He had been convicted of assault with intent to cause great bodily injury, and the prosecutor told Sarah that her testimony could influence the sentence that he received. Sarah wasn't sure she wanted to go, wasn't sure she wanted to see the face of the man who had hurt her, wasn't sure she wanted to relive those terrible days by speaking about them in a courtroom. But she went, and she spoke. And she told the judge about the pain she had experienced, about the fear and the trauma and the months of recovery that it had taken. But she also spoke about something else. She spoke about forgiveness. I have forgiven Marcus, Sarah said, her voice wavering slightly but still strong. Not because what he did was forgivable, not because he deserves forgiveness, but because holding on to my anger and my hate is only hurting me. I have already spent enough of my life suffering because of his actions. I am not going to spend any more of my life imprisoned by my hatred for him. I want him to go to prison because he is dangerous and he needs to be stopped from hurting other people. But I want him to go to prison as a person who will understand the harm he has done, who will have the opportunity to change, who will perhaps one day become a better human being than he is today. The judge sentenced Marcus to 15 years in prison, and Sarah felt the weight of the trial lifted from her shoulders. Justice had been served, in a legal sense at least. But more importantly, Sarah had moved forward. She had not been defined by her anger toward Marcus. She had not let him consume her life after the attack ended. As Sarah walked out of the courtroom with Robert and Comanche beside her, she felt a sense of closure that she had not expected. Not closure in the sense that the trauma was erased or forgotten, but closure in the sense that she was ready to fully move forward with her life. 5 years after the attack, the Healing Companions program had expanded to 12 different cities. Hundreds of trauma survivors had worked with companion animals trained through the program. Dogs that had been rescued from shelters and given a second chance at life, were now providing second chances to human beings who had experienced trauma and were struggling to heal. Sarah had written a book about her experience and the recovery process. The book became a bestseller, translated into multiple languages, read by people around the world who were looking for hope and guidance on their own healing journeys. But perhaps the most meaningful acknowledgement of her journey came on a quiet afternoon when she received a letter from Devon, the troubled teenager she had counseled at the community centre. The letter read, "Miss Sarah, I wanted you to know that my mum finally left my stepdad. She's living in her own apartment now, and she's starting to be happy. She told me that watching you come back to work, seeing that you didn't give up, that gave her the courage to leave. She's in therapy now, and she's trying to heal like you did. Thank you for surviving. Thank you for not giving up. You changed my mum's life, and you changed my life too. I'm going to be a counsellor when I grow up so I can help other people like you helped me. Devon." But these were tears of gratitude, tears of joy, tears that acknowledged the deep meaning and purpose that had emerged from her pain. She thought about Comanche, now an older dog but still working with trauma survivors, still offering his quiet presence and his non-judgmental companionship to people who needed it. She thought about Robert, who had listened to his dog's instincts and had stopped to help a dying woman on the side of a road. She thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by her survival and her decision to turn her trauma into something that could help others. And she thought about the woman lying in the mud, bloodied and broken and convinced she was dying. That woman had been given a second chance by a dog and a stranger, and her own incredible will to survive. But she had also been given something else, a purpose, a reason to survive that went beyond just staying alive. She had been given the opportunity to help others, to show them that recovery was possible, to demonstrate that trauma doesn't have to be the end of your story. On a warm summer evening, Sarah sat on the balcony of her apartment with Comanche beside her, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. She was thriving. She was living a life that was meaningful and full of purpose. And somewhere, a dog had found a woman on the side of a road, had sensed her suffering, and had led his owner to help her. In that moment of connection between human and animal, between the living world and a dying woman, a miracle had occurred. Not the kind of miracle that you read about in religious texts or see in movies, but the everyday kind of miracle that happens when compassion meets suffering, when love meets despair, when one being decides that another being's life is worth saving. Sarah had been beaten and buried in the mud, but she had been raised up again, not back to who she was before. She would never be that person again, but forward into who she was meant to become. A survivor, a healer, a voice for the voiceless, a testament to the incredible strength of the human spirit and the transformative power of love, compassion, and connection. And it had all started with a dog named Comanche, who saw a woman dying in the mud and refused to let her die alone.